Hello, my lovelies. It's Jayne here, bringing you the podcast that's going to guide us all into a new form of relationships so that we can experience the love and the fulfillment that we often really long for, but rarely ever get to experience for extended periods of time. If you can imagine a spectrum of light, and you may have heard already through reading some science reports how our eyes only see a certain spectrum of visible light, right? But there's so much more light that our eyes don't even perceive. We know it's there. Science has told us that there's this great big spectrum of light, but our eyes can only see this small portion. So that's a really great metaphor for relationships because the more I work with people's emotions and the more I learn myself, I can see how the way we've been raised and the way that we've been programmed to behave in our relationships really keeps us in this really small spectrum of relatability. And yet, there's so much more. Generally, this really small spectrum of relatability is determined by the wound that we carry, the emotional wound, because that emotional wound determines how we come into relationship with other people. If I understand that vulnerable part of me, the part of me that feels quite raw and has had an experience in the past, probably many experiences that all landed on me with a similar feeling. So right now I have all of this feeling, which for me it was not good enough, right? So my original wound was about being not good enough, and then I kept recreating unconsciously all of these experiences that kept affirming how not good enough I was. And so when something happened in my day-to-day life or in my relationship and my partner said something to me that made me feel not good enough, because I was predisposed to feel not good enough, I would interpret his behavior or thoughts or whatever he was doing unconsciously in a way that made me feel not good enough. And then I would react. But I would be reacting to his behavior or words. But actually, the reason that I was reacting was because of my wound. It was my wound that had been, like, you can imagine you've got a raw wound. It's really, gross. And if you knock it or you scratch it, it's really, really painful. It's sort of the same with our emotions, right? So I'm going to invite you to think about the fact that it's quite likely you have one of these raw wounds that's quite deep, possibly from childhood, probably from childhood. And this particular wound you've carried with you all your life, and that's not your fault. It's because really, who gets an emotional education? Very few people understand enough about the emotions to understand how to process our emotions in a way that we don't end up having an emotional residual. So we've got all this emotional residual that we've stored in our body. We have an experience now. Our husband says something to us. We react. We think it's because of what he said. But actually, it's because what he said activated my raw wound. Now, the good thing about this is, actually, let me tell you the bad thing about this first. The bad thing about this is, because I don't realize that he's activated my raw wound, I keep trying to get him to behave differently. And I think that if he behaves differently, I'm going to feel better. So I'm constantly trying to fix him, or I'm constantly trying to, I don't know, make him speak to me differently, or grow up, or listen, or support me, or whatever it is I'm trying to get him to do, because I think that is going to make me feel better. But the bad news is it's actually not, because the raw wound is still there, right? So it's only going to take another incident where he may say something and my wound gets activated for me to react again. Because I have this raw wound, I'm more likely to react. So if I come to see that the reason I react is not because of my partner's behavior, but the reason I react is because my raw wound has been activated. And the bad news is I'm always going to be activated because I'm trying to fix that raw wound. I'm trying to heal it by making my partner change his behavior. This is generally not conscious. I spend a lot of years trying to make things right so that I can feel better. And yet it never works because I haven't healed the emotional wound that lies at the core of my being. The good news is that I can do that myself. In fact, I'm the only person that can do that for me. And the reason this is good news is because, well, have you ever tried to change somebody? It's impossible. You can't change people, places, or things. They're going to do what they do. And even with the best intentions, even if they don't want to do it, they're human, right? So they're probably going to turn up in a way that really activates you, whether it's deliberate or not. So I feel empowered when I can deal with my own emotional vulnerability or my own emotional wound on the inside. I feel so empowered. And the great news, like that's just the good news. The great news is when I learn how to do that, when I actually learn how to really address the wounded reaction in me so that I can feel empowered and I can step back into my presence, then the next word, thought, or action that I take actually has great results. It's really a no-brainer, isn't it? And it's so often I used to go, why was I never taught this? It seems so simple that if I actually make myself feel okay, if I do what I know I need to do to get myself back into a state where I feel emotionally regulated, I feel present, I feel whole, and then I act, of course I'm going to get better results than when I try to fix things from reaction. And yet I spent so many years I would be reacting. And from my reaction, from my helplessness, from my powerlessness, I was trying to fix what I didn't like. Even with my kids, I'd be like feeling so powerless. I had twin boys and a daughter, and that really, I had moments where I was just like, I don't know what to do. What am I meant to do? And I felt so helpless. And yet from that emotional state, I was trying to make things right. I was trying to fix things. I was trying to change my life. Now it makes total sense to me that I never had any success, because why would I? I was trying to make things right from foundations of feeling helpless, powerless. I felt like I had no resources. I felt not good enough. And here I am trying to make things work from that state of being. So, of course, all I did was create more of the same. Not deliberately, of course, because, hey, if I knew how to do this ages ago, I would have done it ages ago. So when I started looking at my relationships through a new spectrum of perception, which is essentially what it is, I started to see that each time I reacted, I had a feeling, I was agitated, I felt powerless. All of those feelings were inside of me. And when I started to address those first, when I started to pay attention to those, when I started to actually show up for myself and go, oh, hey, you've got a feeling happening here. What do I need to do for myself right now? And I learned the skills and tools for that, which I'm going to be sharing with you in these podcasts, because that's the whole idea of hanging out with me. When I started to look at everything that happened to me, and before I reacted to blame or punish or feel resentful, to cast my attention outside of myself at whatever it was I thought was causing the pain, I stopped and I paid attention to my feeling. And I owned that feeling. And then I really used that, because I could see how if I paid attention to that feeling, I was able to grow. I was able to start to choose what to be, say, or do in the next moment with more deliberate awareness. This was absolutely profound for me, because rather than feeling helpless in my relationships, rather than feeling like this is just what my relationship was and I had to put up with things, I actually knew that in the moment, I didn't have to put up with that. In this moment, I don't have to feel powerless. I discovered that in this moment, I don't have to feel helpless. That I can actually use this moment not only to not feel powerless, but to feel more empowered. I can use this moment not only not to feel helpless, but to experience more of my potential and unlock parts of myself that had been repressed for a really long time. This was like huge, because so many relationships, we just sort of accept that this is how it is. But I felt like I'd been given this key to a door that I didn't even know was there. Here's the key. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's a key. Are you kidding me? Why wasn't I ever told there was a key? Why wasn't I even told there was a door? But you know what? I'm telling you now, there's a key and there's a door. And what happens is the way you view your relationship, rather than being in a small spectrum, which you think you can't get out of, which you think is going to be like that forever, you can now see an infinite potential for your relationship once you walk through that door. You don't have to feel frustrated. You don't have to go round and round in these dynamics. You don't have to do that. Of course, there's a catch. The catch is that it means you have to take responsibility for your emotions. You can't blame anybody else for how you feel anymore. You can't blame circumstances. You can't be helpless. You actually have to step up and become an emotional adult. Even though that sounds a bit scary, and yes, you're going to have to really access your courage. But personally, what I've experienced is an infinite amount of freedom inside myself. Freedom, ease, joy, connection. That's why I went into relationships in the first place, because I wanted to feel love. I wanted to be loved. I wanted to feel connection. And yet, as soon as I went into a relationship, I started to fear I was going to lose the person I was in a relationship with. I started to feel less secure about myself. I started to feel like I had to be something to keep the relationship going. I started to filter all the words I said. So actually over time, what I got was less connection, was less love, was less security, was more bondage. I felt like I was trapped in a cage, these repetitive dynamics that went on and on and on. And it's like just saying the same things to him over and over again. And him saying the same things to me over and over again. Feeling like I was walking on eggshells all the time. Feeling like I couldn't speak up. Getting the silent treatment and wondering what I'd done wrong. And I'm sure there were just as many things that I did that annoyed him. But I didn't even see that the way I was in relationship, because let's take it back to the metaphor of the spectrum of light, right? I was in this little spectrum of relationship that was wholly dependent on my capacity to deal with my wounded child in that moment. Now, I grew a bit of capacity to deal with that hurt, but I didn't actually step out of that spectrum. And I actually think this might be why, I know it was for me anyway, why I did so much work on myself, why I went to so many workshops, and still I would come home and I'd have a great couple of weeks and then I would just resort back into those old patterns of behavior again and I'd feel frustrated. That's because I never actually expanded my spectrum of relatability. I stayed within that space of relatability. Because in order for me to expand my spectrum of relatability, I had to understand how to process my feelings in a way that empowered me. And that's not something that I can learn with my head. It's not something I can learn from a book. So today, my challenge for you is just imagine if there was a completely different reality for your relationship. Something that perhaps you've never been exposed to, that you've never seen, because it certainly isn't in our movies. It certainly wasn't taught to us by our parents, for most of us anyway. But imagine if there is. Imagine if there was a door and a key, and that the door might be a metaphor for your true self, and the key, perhaps your emotions. I've certainly learned that if I can take full responsibility for everything I feel and work with my emotions in an emerging process, I can access my true self. And if I access my wholeness, my natural state, my true self, whatever you want to call it, when I access that and I live my relationships from that, my relationships are completely transformed, almost upside down to what they used to be. Actually, right side up. My relationships are now right side up. My relationships are right side up because now they feel more loving, more connected over time, rather than less loving and less connected over time. That's my invitation to you for today. Just open your mind and imagine that there may be an alternative to what's happening right now in your relationship. And that alternative might be very accessible to you right here and now. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to change anything externally. You actually have the power right now by learning how to address the way you feel so that you can increase your capacity for relatability. Remember to subscribe so you can stay up to date with any more tools and skills that I share with you. Sending you love.